Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation for me and my colleague Anna Mørck from Norway, Oslo, from the Norwegian Center for Violence and Traumatic Stress Studies. So we are very happy to be here. We have been cooperating with the Shelter's Secretariat, Ea Reitelmann's Secretariat, for the last few years in a project that you can read more about here in English, but I suppose it exists also in Estonia. It has been a very nice cooperation that unfortunately now soon is coming to its end, but it doesn't mean that our cooperation and friendship would not continue. We are dividing this talk so that I start, then my colleague Anna comes in, and then I will say some finishing words towards the end. We come from the Norwegian Center for Violence and Traumatic Stress Studies, just very, very shortly about that institution. It is a research, knowledge, and competence center in three thematic fields. Firstly, violence in close relations, and that relates to our topic here today. Secondly, traumatic stress, catastrophes, disasters, accidents, terrorism, and stress, traumatic stress related to such events. We have huge research programs also in this field. For example, based on the horrible events 4.5 years ago in Oslo and on the island of Utøya. The third field we are working on is traumatized refugees, also a topic which is highly, highly topical in today's Europe and certainly also in Norway. But today we speak about violence, violence against women, domestic violence, violence in close relations. Different concepts are used, and as I see it pragmatically, can be used and should be used. We all have slightly different angles and approaches to this very important issue. So let's continue using different concepts if we want. In Norway, the topic of violence in the family against women and also other family members has been both on the political agenda and the research agenda at least since the 1970s. Of course, there has been things happening before that, but in the 1970s, thanks to the new women's movement, this issue that until then had been hidden and largely a taboo issue was brought out into the public. For the new women's movement, the main slogan was, "The private is the political." And this was something that really caught on fire in the new women's movement. And it spread to the larger women's movement. We have to remember when we talk about the women's movement in the Nordic countries and in Norway, and certainly also here, we do not only speak about the young radical students and Red Stockings in the 1970s. They were a core group. They were a very important group. But this issue, violence against women, was immediately taken aboard by other women's organizations across the political sphere. Housewives' organizations, which in those days was a very influential and the largest women's organization in Norway. Because in Norway in the 1970s, a big part of married women worked at home, not in the labor market. This has rapidly changed since then. But we are now going back in history 40 years. But the women's movement politicized the private issue of violence in the home and put it on the agenda, on the political agenda, and also the young students in the academic spheres, on the academic agenda. And this did not only happen in Norway, of course. This happened across the Western world. We are talking now about 1970s, when we had Europe still divided clearly in Western and Eastern Europe. The first shelter was founded in London, in United Kingdom, in 1971. But the first Nordic women's shelter was established in Oslo in 1978, together with a helpline, a telephone line. And those were young activists who did this, grassroots level. And the shelter movements quickly became the most important part of the women's movement in those days, and it rapidly spread. The shelter movement idea spread. Many were first skeptical. Many politicians, policymakers, the establishment said that, is this really such a big problem? And is this really something that we have to deal with? Isn't it just to try to talk to the husbands and the partners and try to see how to solve things? But after very active lobbying from the feminist and the women's movement activists, gradually the issue came on the political agenda. Norway is a very small country. I know Estonia is even smaller, but that means that there were very close relationships in those days between the activists, the shelter activists in the movement, the young researchers and students in the universities, and a part of the so-called femocrats, feminist-oriented, or let's say women's issues-oriented. If the word feminism is here a little bit touchy, then I say women's rights-oriented bureaucrats in the state apparatus who quickly found a common tone and started to demand funding, started to demand more shelters to be established. Simultaneously, when the shelters spread around the country, we had another innovation. These are social innovations, folks. I mean, nowadays everybody talks about innovations. This is an excellent example of a social innovation from social movements in the 70s and 80s. So in addition to the shelters, we also had programs for perpetrators, for the abusive men. And the first European intervention program for abusive men was established in Norway in 1987. The founding mother was a woman who still today is my colleague as a senior researcher in my center, and she was a shelter activist in those days, a young activist. But she saw that in really to do something with this problem, we need shelters to protect the women, but we need to do something with these men. So that's how ATV as an organization was founded. Now, the shelter concept, this social innovation, what does it mean? I mean, many of you work in shelters, you know exactly what it means. But it's very important, I think, that we lift ourselves up and say this was very something new, creative. Low threshold. The idea is that women who are victims of violence need immediate access to help, even if it would be, as it often is, middle of the night. We do not need a system where you have to be referred to a shelter. That's what I mean with low threshold. It has to be flexible. It has to meet different needs of different women. These are very important starting points for the shelter concept. Sorry. Shelters are and should be home-like. They're like housing collectives. And it's also important, from the beginning it was important, that those women who stayed there participate in all household tasks, cleaning and making food and so on. So it is not and should not be like an institution. And I think this is also still today, when there has been a professionalization, an important part of the concept. Children were certainly something that was thought of from the beginning. Women want to have their children with them when they come to escape the abuser or perpetrator in the family. So then special housing accommodation needs have to be fulfilled for the children. And gradually we also started to see the children not only as witnesses of violence, but also victims themselves, even if in a case when they would not have been as such objects for, somebody hitting them. But you are a victim also if you live in a family circumstances where there is constant fear and constant violence. Shelter concept includes both physical but also emotional safety and this possibility to stay overnight, which is so important. Which other institutions can offer you that? And the police, for example, has always from the beginning been really thankful and grateful that they had these addresses what to do when they were called to homes middle of the night, what to do with the woman and her children. In the shelters, they did not offer treatment services per se, but could refer to the general social service, health service apparatus and the police. So the cooperation here between different groups is essential, has always been essential. Now, this is a concept created by and developed by the women's activists. And in those days in Norway, a very important principle was flat structure, non-hierarchical structure, women helping other women. This, of course, gradually shown not to be such an easy concept. You can have hidden power structures behind a seemingly flat surface. So there were also tensions in this. But I would say that although we have had a gradual professionalization of the shelters, volunteers, voluntary activists is still an important part of Norwegian shelters. Their numbers have decreased and the professionals have increased, but they have not disappeared. And I think that is, as long as we manage to keep that, I think it's important. This, especially in the beginning, strong link to the women's movement was also a challenge. As a result, our we had until this summer 2 umbrella organizations, one more closely linked to the more radical feminist approach to the violence issue, the other having, let's say, more multifaceted approach. So ideologically somewhat different. But these differences, I would say, as an outsider, I come from Finland myself, have lived in Norway 10 years, so I see the society a little bit from the outside, and I think they have been closer as they would admit themselves. And since the summer, we have only one umbrella organization. Shortly now here. I claim, and not only I claim, but in my center we have done research showing that the shelters are still today the only type of services available that have the victims as their primary target groups. In many other services, violence can be a part of something. There can be alcohol, drugs, poverty, need for social assistance, health problems, but the shelters have this as their core issue. From 1978, from the first shelter in Oslo was founded, until 2010, when the Norwegian Parliament decided that shelters are so important that we have to guarantee their existence through a law that makes the shelters to a council obligation. But until then, they were also funded by public authorities. So, of course, Norway has until now, been quite lucky concerning the oil and the gas, etc., and the welfare state structure. So we have also benefited from that, as many other forms of social services. But since 2010, the law on shelters meant that now we have guaranteed the structure. It's much more difficult to get rid of the shelters if somebody would like to. I don't think anybody will. But now they are anchored firmly in the law. We have a new user group, men. The law is written in a gender-neutral way. But the men who seek assistance, and they do exist, they are of course not as many as the women. They are very few in numbers, but they do exist. And they have to have physically separated accommodation in the shelters. This was a demand also from many women's organizations. User surveys, very shortly, at my center show that those who go to the shelters, those women, are in some ways different from the average Norwegian woman, if you look statistically. They are somewhat younger. 70% are younger than 40 years of age. Many of them are outside the labor market, dependent either on a male provider, husband, or dependent on social assistance from the welfare state. And most Norwegian women are today in the labor market. So the shelter clients is a little bit different group here. Many of them lack social networks, and especially in the big cities, we today have a majority coming from ethnic minority families, especially those who stay in the shelters over the night. Those who come during the day to look for help, there it's not the same kind of domination from ethnic minority women, from migrant women, refugee background, etc. But for those who stay overnight, probably because they lack social networks or can't afford to go to a hotel, as perhaps at least some of the Norwegian-born women can. All right, now very shortly, so Anna can come in. Why shelters? Why not just ordinary services? As was said before the coffee break, especially in the beginning, many women felt that they are not taken seriously enough by the police or the ordinary help apparatus. Much has changed here. Police in Norway has family violence coordinators. They just launched a huge national campaign against family violence, but still today we know that violence is not always seen as a problem in its own right. Perhaps the methods used, for example, in family counseling, are not always adequate in a situation where you fear your partner or your partner controls you. Perhaps there's not possibility to negotiate. Often you have nowhere else to go, etc. So shelters are still needed, and obviously also policymakers and legislators agree because we now have the new law. There is a challenge with having good cooperation between the different agencies, shelters and different agencies. There has been increased cooperation, but problems do remain. Anna.
So good afternoon, and thank you again to EA for inviting us. Very happy about that, happy about being here. I will pick up a little bit where Solveig left off with the coordination. But first I will just say a few words about legal frameworks. Legal framework for shelter services is something that is covered in the Istanbul Convention, the Council of Europe Istanbul Convention. So I will go a little bit into that, and then I will focus on two studies that has been made at our center about shelters and the quality of services. But first, a little bit about the legal standards. So today we actually have a convention that sets standards for protection through defining specialized services. And they include access to adequate information, setting up easily accessible shelters, making available a free of charge 24/7 helpline, but also the Istanbul Convention includes something they call integrated policies. It asks states to implement coordinated policies involving both government agencies, local and regional authorities, as well as NGOs. And as Estonia, Norway is also in the process of ratifying the convention and is amending and making new national legislation. And it's also in Norway, I think, political consensus about the content of this. So the legal obligations, like in the Istanbul Convention, are quite specific about the protection and the standards of assistance to victims and about coordinated policy measures. So I'll then go a little bit into the two studies, and let me just see the new slide. Coordination and cooperation. There was a study from the NKVTS, the center where we work, with a very long name. There was a study from 2014 that looks at the provision of support to victims of violence with a view to the helpers as well as the users of the services. And the data is collected through focus groups. It's a qualitative study, and it's collected through focus groups and interviews with employees in the services and victims themselves. And one of the main challenges identified is namely cooperation and coordination. Cooperation between service providers, between agencies, and various levels of authorities has been on the agenda for decades, as Solveig pointed out, and most notably in a number of national action plans from the government. But this study, as other studies also have, prove that cooperation and coordination is still an elusive practice. Collaboration is frequently described as the key to providing care successfully. And the participants in the study shared a desire to see better coordination and better cooperation on the delivery of care from the various agencies. Even expertise is by many participants in the study defined as the ability to make the most of the possibilities inherent in collaborating with others. And knowing how to build relations with victims and their families and friends, as well as with members of other professions, seems to be of the essence. But there are barriers to collaboration and coordination. And the service providers point out lack of time and lack of knowledge of other professions' work methods. And this suggests that there may be a professional barrier to cooperation as well as a capacity problem. Many of the respondents were positive to establishing a domestic violence focal point or a domestic violence coordinator in every municipality. There was one of the municipalities that was targeted by this study where there was such a coordinator. And this coordinator was praised endlessly. Cooperation is also something that has to be constantly reenacted. There is staff turnover and there is burnout of dedicated individuals. And successful cooperation is depending on commitment from a leadership and management level in the various agencies. Not least, cooperation is a skill and it should be taught. For the victims, cooperation and coordination among helpers is beneficial for at least two reasons. Not to have to tell your story many times over to different helpers. Getting assistance to sort out needs and how to address them more effectively in an extremely stressful situation. Finally, cooperation with the victim is very important. To include the victim in decision-making, to have an open mind and to listen to their stories is also an important quality for establishing good cooperation with the victim and his or her family and friends. Also last year, there was an evaluation of shelters, a study that was made by another research center, Norwegian Social Research Center, Norra. And this study analyzed the trends in the development of shelter services after the implementation of the Shelter Act from 2010, that also Solveig you mentioned. And the act made it obligatory for all municipalities in Norway to provide shelter services to their population. And most municipalities finance the shelters that were existing, and they are not running their own, or few are running their own shelters. This Shelter Act also defined two new user groups, men and children. Overall, the results of this study are positive. We are on the right track. Finances, after the act, finances has improved for 40% of the shelters. Victims at the shelters generally feel safe and are satisfied with assistance. And there has been a positive impact on children's situation. But there are some negative results. And they relate to lack of adequate assistance to persons with additional problems and needs, such as drug addiction, mental problems, and disabilities. There is also a lack of compliance with the law regarding the housing for men, shelter for men. But another important finding is that the municipalities lack a good coordination of a cohesive chain of assistance, and the responsibilities seem to be unclear. The law then states that the shelter services shall coordinate assistance, and the scope of cooperation between shelters and other services has increased. But, there's always a but, there are major challenges of cooperation and coordination between services and agencies. So I'll give the final words to Solveig.
Okay, a few more minutes. So in sum, we can say that during the last 40 years, violence against women has increasingly been defined as a problem related to public health. It's a public health problem. It is also a problem of gender equality and about human, that is in practice, women's rights. We have in Norway today a functioning infrastructure, a functioning system, a functioning framework for support services, although there are problems with cooperation and coordination, as pointed out by Anna. And we have knowledge development. We have our center, we have the regional centers, and other research institutions working with these issues. So is Norway a paradise? No. I won't go through these. These are just some highlights from a prevalence study that our center did 2 years ago, or 1 year ago, based on a representative survey amongst adult Norwegians. So it is quite new figures. But at least the Norwegian newspapers and public were shocked about these figures. We who work with these issues were not surprised. So more than 9% of women report rape, that they have been raped at least once in their lifetime. 1% of men. So almost 10% of Norwegian women. When it comes to physical violence, as the ambassador already said in the morning, we have significantly more women who report severe forms of physical violence, including feeling threatened to life. 8.2% of women in Norway and almost 2% of men. When it comes to less severe, put it like this, researchers divide violence in severe and less severe. When it comes to less severe violence, we have in practice no gender difference. And now the last issues. I won't go into these, but both shelters, policymakers and academics face new challenges because society is changing. Women are still, of course, the biggest group of victims, and that should not be forgotten. The numbers are clear, and the violence women experience is more severe than violence than other groups of men, for example, experience. However, we cannot close our eyes also for the other dimensions of violence. Children, we already touched upon, elderly, people with disabilities, men, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans relationships, hate crimes. The Minister of Justice also discussed new challenges because of the increased multiculturalism in Norwegian society, and so on. These are new challenges that we are taking on board and that we include in the broad concept of violence in close relations. Thank you for your attention.